welcome or welcome back to folks who've been with us to this day 2 of this series of short conversations with people whose knowledge and experience will support your teaching and organizing in the struggle for a free Palestine and the right of return, and against the ongoing U.S.-Israeli colonization, occupation, settlement, and genocide that is a century in the making. This is our final conversation of a 2-day series of discussions, so we thank you all for joining us. As we close out, special thank yous to Elon Dancy and Christy McGuire of the Center for Urban Education for collaborating to create the event, to Nakia Washington Butler, Fiona Seals, Kelly Runco, and Caitlin Zerker for tech support. To my dear friends and colleagues, Uju Agrawal and Lisa Ortiz, for helping generously in the shaping of these conversations, and to everyone who helped circulate this event widely. We had 250 people registered this morning before we hopped on for today's first speaker. So you all are amazing. We're just really grateful that you've been with us today. I am Sabina Vaught, and I am honored to be welcoming Dr. Nyle Fort, a minister, activist, and scholar who studies how people resist oppression, build beloved community, and struggle to transform the world. He is assistant professor of African American and African diaspora studies at Columbia University. Nyle's 2 current book projects, Spirit of Struggle and Amazing Grief, meditate on the work of spirit and mourning in Black and multiracial freedom movements. His writing is featured in The Guardian, The Boston Globe, The New York Magazine, Socialism and Democracy, Harvard Journal of African American Public Policy, and There's a Revolution Outside. I love Letters from a Crisis. Dr. Fort, thank you for being with us today in the midst of what I'm observing on social media is a really urgent and busy time for you on the ground with your organizing.
Thank you. Well, thank you first for having me, and thank you all who were instrumental in making this happen. I'm very happy to be here and be invited, and very happy to be a student of many of the people that you all invited to share. And just want to start by saying I still have so much to learn. So I take myself to be more of a student than a scholar of social movements and what's happening in Palestine and in Gaza. So yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
I have questions for you, but I also want to just start by opening it up and ask if there's a place you want us to begin thinking with you.
Sure. I can just say a brief thing about myself. And I was hoping you didn't keep reading my bio because I got so embarrassed. I was like, please just stop with this first and second line. I became a minister at 16 years old in a Black Baptist church. I grew up in the church my whole life. And so my first relationship with Israel and Zionism was actually through the church and was through reading the Bible. And so what I didn't know then, but do know now, is in terms of the relationship between religion and Zionism, religion and the movement for justice in Palestine, is a very complex relationship, particularly with Black people and Black Christians. And so historically, in many ways, the Bible was our history book. I was talking to Mumia Abu-Jamal earlier, political prisoner, and he had that wonderful phrase. He said, no, our Bible is a history book. And the particular book in the Bible that was so instrumental for Black people imagining freedom was Exodus. Of course, that's the story of the Israelites who were under Egyptian bondage. And except in this context, African Americans, Black Americans took ourselves to be the Israelites and took America to be Egypt. So that analogy, considering how instrumental the Black church has been in the history of Black people in this country, put us in a very complex relationship to this question of Zionism and Zion. And so there's been a long journey. I'll just start by saying, being a 16-year-old preacher and minister, knowing very little about the political context of what's happening in Israel and Palestine, not really actually knowing what Palestine was at all, going from that to now, where through a lot of struggle and activism and tremendous teachers, some of whom you've had on, having a much better grasp of actually what's going on there and the role of religion in this movement and in this violence. Just want to start there, but I'm open to any questions. I have lots to share, but it's open to questions.
So you actually touched on one of my questions, and maybe we'll come back, but you sort of raised another question for me. And so it sounds as if there's an interesting, maybe tension, maybe dialogue, maybe something else. I'm not sure what the relationship is, but between long-standing, I mean, decades and decades long-standing Black solidarity from the so-called US or North America with Palestine and Palestinian liberation, and then what you described as this sort of framing or understanding or influence of Black church. So I wonder if you might talk about that relationship, or if that would be interesting to you to talk about, and if not, we can move in another direction.
No, I mean, Black Palestinian solidarity was a part of the story that I never heard. I had heard, like many of us, probably, stories of Black Jewish solidarity, especially during the civil rights movement. I think perhaps one of the most famous examples would be Dr. King, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., standing alongside Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And that image is really, I think, imprinted on the imagination. And of course, you have Jewish college students going to the South in the 1960s to help Black people register to vote. These are stories that are very important stories because they're historically accurate, and they are very much a part of the Black freedom struggle. However, there's another part of the story which is oftentimes not told, not known, or purposely buried because of the potential that it has for liberation struggles today. And that's the story of Black Palestinian solidarity. I think of Palestine as an essential chapter of the larger Black freedom struggle, which has always been global. And so we have a long tradition of standing alongside the most vulnerable, the most oppressed across space and across time. I mean, we can think about so many examples. When Britain colonized the Indian subcontinent, you had Black activists and intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, who critiqued the British imperialism on the subcontinent. When we have the Vietnam War, you have, who I just mentioned, Dr. King, April 4th, 1967, stands up on the Riverside Church pulpit, and he critiques the U.S.'s war in Vietnam and makes connections between the amount of money that we were spending on the war alongside the neglect, the institutional neglect of schooling and of all kinds of, fundamental resources that will help Black communities right here. We can think about, of course, apartheid South Africa, which was one of the major ways that a lot of Black activists were entering into this broader struggle. And so you have all of these connections that are being made. I mean, when Italy invaded Ethiopia, you had Black activists, Black women activists like Ella Baker, who was flooding the streets of Harlem alongside other Black folks who was critiquing Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. And then in 2014, when Ferguson exploded, white police officer Darren Wilson shoot and kills Black teenager Michael Brown, you see this once again, particularly in the context of Palestine. And so I was one of those kids in the street in 2014. I had just graduated from seminary, and I was watching TV and on social media, and alongside everybody else, I was getting so angry about what was happening. Ended up going to Ferguson and St. Louis. And it was there that I was actually tear gassed, as many other people were. And there was a co-founder of a group called the Dream Defenders, which is an amazing group. If you don't know about the Dream Defenders, please look them up. One of the co-founders is a Palestinian American. And he was telling us that the same tear gas canisters that the Ferguson police and the St. Louis police, alongside many police departments across the country, the same tear gas canisters they were using were also being used on Palestinian protesters and Palestinian people in the context of the occupation and the settler colonial project there. So that blew my mind. I'm like, wait, I thought Israel was God's plan. That's what I learned when I was 16 as a minister. Now it's opening my mind through real experiences in the streets. And so I think that's important to understand, that Palestine is a part of that broader tradition of internationalism. Black people, of course, stood up with the landless farmers movement in Brazil. You can talk about standing up with indigenous people in Standing Rock. And so there's so many examples. And there's really, I think of Fannie Lou Hamer. Ella Baker's important. Fannie Lou Hamer, I think she says it best when she said, nobody's free until everybody's free. I think that's been a big proverb in Black struggle. And so another thing is that there are Black Palestinians. They're Afro-Palestinians. And so it's so funny. Even Black people will ask me, why should Black people care about, what's happening in Palestine? I'm like, well, there's Black people in Palestine. There's a small but rich community of Black Palestinians, Afro-Palestinians, who live in the Muslim quarter, many of whom were religious pilgrims, and many of whom were essential to the movement for justice in Palestine from the very beginning, before 1948 and during and after 1948. And that's really important to remember. So there's many other examples, but that's a part of it. And I would say one more. I know I'm talking a lot, but I get really excited about talking about Black internationalism. Of course, Black folks' relationship to Zionism is complex, but it wasn't just complex because of the biblical story of Exodus. It was also complex because Black people, many of whom saw this as a real national liberation project. And as a group of people who were trying to find some place to be safe in our context, a place to have dignity, amidst a history of racial domination, there was a resonance between another oppressed group of people who in our minds were looking for Zion and in the context of Babylon, to use those kind of analogies. That story is oftentimes told in the mainstream. So you have a Dr. King, who's constantly quoted by the religious right, by the political right, and even by liberals, and use sound bites to say, well, and of course, whatever Dr. King says, all Black people should, it represents all Black people somehow, which I think is ridiculous. But what's not told is that after 1967, when the military occupation is created, which is still firmly intact, many Black people began to shift on that relationship. So you have the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee writing that essay, The Palestine Problem, and really critiquing what's happening in there. You have the Black Panther Party, which analogized Black people as living in an internal colony, understanding the relationship between Black and Palestinian struggle. You have Malcolm X, who goes to Gaza and who writes that, classic essay, Zionist Logic. This is oftentimes not told. You have Toni Morrison, you have June Jordan, you have Muhammad Ali, you have James Baldwin, you have so many Black activists who, especially after 1967, but some of whom before, begin to stand up for Palestine. So I think that's a part of it. And there have been many Palestinians who've also stood up for Black folks. So Black Palestinian solidarity is not a one-way street. It's a two-way street. And so you have examples that are extremely important. You have Association of Arab American University graduates who spotlighted these economic and military engagements and arrangements between Israel and apartheid South Africa. You have activist groups like the Organization of Arab Students, who invite Stokely Carmichael to their national convention. Also lobbying Shirley Chisholm in 1972 during her presidential run. You have Arab American activists who formed an Arab Workers Caucus in Michigan, and many of those labor formations were modeled after Black radical labor unions. So that's also an important story to tell. And in 2014, which I mentioned, you have activists like Bassem, who was on the front lines, a Palestinian protester in St. Louis, who were on the front lines of the protests there. And so I think thinking about Black Palestinian solidarity in both ways is really important.
Yeah. And I'm hearing so multiple things, if maybe I can pull it together. One being that solidarity is a reciprocal relationship, and that it is both studied. So I hear you describing, reading a significant history, and also it's studied in the streets, in the work of collaboration. So you studied a history as you were protesting alongside other people. And I wonder if you might bring those sort of frameworks and tell us the story of right now for you. So how you're learning in your sort of study in organizing and activism from and with other people, how that's connecting to the long tradition of Black internationalism, and then this shared liberation struggle with Palestinian peoples everywhere, and sort of what is emerging right now for you and how you're organizing through that learning.
Yeah, I mean, I immediately think of Robin D.G. Kelley, who someone described as the jazziest historian in America, I would say on earth. But Robin D.G. Kelley has a phrase that he said he put on his desk as an educator: love, study, struggle, in that order. And so I think it's, for me, really in that framework that I find myself today, that I found myself in all of my journey of activism. Study is important because in order for us to address a problem or a crisis, we have to understand exactly what that problem or crisis is. And sometimes we're actually think that, for example, like this started in October 7th. And so if our starting point of the crisis is October 7th, then the limits of our demands would be a ceasefire and humanitarian aid. But if we understand that we have to go back to 1967, for example, to understand the military occupation, and then go even further back to 1948 and understanding the Nakba, the catastrophe, and going back again to 1917 and understanding the Balfour Declaration and how essentially Britain just gives the green light for a Jewish homeland on Palestinian land. And so, and then you can go even further back, but understanding, having political clarity about what's happening is extremely important. I learned, for example, through political education, it's not a religious conflict, which is oftentimes a kind of mainstream way of thinking. Oh, this must be between Jews and Muslims. This is about land. This is about resources. This is about domination and control. This is about geopolitical interests, oil and things like that. And so I've learned most of that outside of the classroom. And I've learned the formal classroom, and I've learned most of that in collective study with other activists. And so when I was in Ferguson, Robin Kelley came to Ferguson during a meeting that we had and basically told us about Freedom Dreams, his book, Freedom Dreams, and how I didn't know what the word tradition meant in the way he was describing it. And so looking and saying, oh, we're a part of something that's been in the making for centuries, it completely changed my idea, one, of the magnitude of the problem. We're not dealing with a problem, we're dealing with a catastrophe that's been ongoing, but also made me realize the magnitude of the freedom liberation movement that has been in the making for so long. And so I believe that the best forms of education are collective. I believe the best forms of education encourage curiosity. Sometimes, we can read some tweets or some Instagram posts and it's like, I got it, we're scrolling through on our couch or whatever. And that's cool. And I'm not knocking that, any kind of information we can get, but real political education happens through struggle with other people with real concrete problems in mind. Okay, so we want a ceasefire. How does that happen? Well, some folks said, well, we'll stop a ship that has actual armed weapons on it, because one way to have a ceasefire is to just stop the fire. We're going to stop the ship. So that takes, I think, really collective study. The Black Panther Party is oftentimes seen as some gun-toting Black kids who hated cops. They did hate cops for good reasons. But they also had the rifle in one hand and they had a law book in the other hand. When they would do cop watching, which is also a part of a longer tradition, they understood the laws in California, which informed their ability to organize. Of course, even Bobby Seale and Huey Newton were college students. They were at Merritt College. They were swept up in student activism and organizing coming out of San Francisco State, where you have the first Black Studies department. So there's a long tradition of collective activist-based study that has, what are the ways that the world is organized that devalues people, and how do we then take our knowledge of how the world works, as Marx says, to change it. The point is not to just understand it, but to change
it. I know that my dear friend, Dr. Elon Dancy, who co-created this with me, is sitting very happy right now because you're singing his song. So we're appreciating everything you're saying.
Awesome.
I want to ask though about the role of religion, religious organizing, spirituality, because while you made the important point that what is happening in this genocide, the long colonization, the long genocide, is not about religion. Liberation, it has many dimensions that are religious and spiritual for many people. And I think particularly as we're talking to educators, there's this sort of, fake separation of church and state. That's framework. And I think educators can struggle with how to think about the role of religion, organized religion, religious organizing.
Yeah.
So, right. And yet it's central to liberation movement. So how might people be thinking about all that you just said, right? Study, struggle, all that work, but through the context of liberatory religious organizing?
Yeah, I think that, and let me try to clarify, it's not that this does not have anything to do with religion, but it's that it is not fundamentally a religious conflict. It's not the best way to think about what's happening, but it's deeply informed by religion, for sure. And we see that in many ways. One, we can just talk about the side of injustice. You have the rise of white Christian nationalism. I actually just read that over half of Republicans believe that the United States of America should be a Christian nation. I put that in quotes because religion is a site of contestation. You have Christian Zionism, this idea that there's a biblical promise for Jewish people to have a homeland, and that the creation of Israel in 1948 was the fulfillment of that promise. You have groups like CUFI, Christians United for Israel, which are some of the most powerful lobbying groups in the United States of America, who literally organize on HBCU campuses, historically Black colleges and universities. And what they do is they go and they especially recruit the student leaders, SGA presidents, so on and so forth, say, hey, there's a free trip to Israel that we'll take you on. And, of course, you Black, first in your family go to college, yeah, I'll go to Israel. And through that process are also indoctrinating them and politicizing them in the very wrong direction. I think thinking about how the not just religious right and not just the political right, but the establishment has used religion in many ways to beef up white Christian nationalism and Christian Zionism. I also think, as you said, that it's important for us to know that religion has been used, yes, as a site of oppression, but also as a site of liberation. And there's a long tradition. We can think about people like David Walker, in the context of slavery. He writes his appeal in 1829. And central to his appeal is this idea that Black people should read the Bible in liberatory ways to fight against slavery. You have Nat Turner. This was a preacher. This was an itinerant minister. You have Denmark Vesey, who was central to the building of the AME Church. So when Dylan Roof kills the 9 people at Mother Emanuel, which Denmark Vesey helped found, we have to understand this long tradition, not just of church bombings, but of Black people who have been fundamental to liberation movements, from slave insurrectionists all the way through the 1960s movements to today. I think that's extremely important. There is a Black liberation theology tradition, which James Cone is one of the founders of, who are using religious scripture and symbolism and stories on the side of the oppressed for Black folks and across the board. You have people like Reverend Jeremiah Wright, who was Obama's former pastor, which he lambasted, after he said some unkind words about the United States of America, who has stood up for Palestine for throughout his entire ministry. And then you have collective groups who are organizing right now. One of my most exciting things is watching Jewish Voice for Peace. Jewish Voice for Peace, the organization, are a group of primarily Jewish activists who are fighting, and promoting anti-Zionism, which is so important because it shows, one, that Israel does not speak for all Jews. And it also shows that there are deep, beautiful traditions within Judaism that people are pulling on, like Jewish Voice for Peace, to promote a world of justice and of freedom. And so this very same religion that can be used to justify oppression is the very same religion that could be used to fight for freedom. And we see that in Jewish traditions and organizing. We see that in Muslim traditions and organizing. We did a march here in DC a few weeks ago, and there was thousands of Muslims who came and descended on the National Mall and who actually had Friday prayer. We invited an imam to come to this march and rally about a ceasefire and humanitarian aid and ending the occupation, and using that as a space of prayer. So it's really amazing for me to see that, and it's really encouraging to know that the conservatives, that the religious right, that even the liberal establishment does not have a monopoly on what it means to be moral, what it means to be Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, anything, and that we have that option.
Thank you for that.
Of course.
I think that, many people on the call would gain quite a bit from hearing about your organizing right now, sort of what you're doing right now, kind of on the ground, who it's with, what the strategies are, where you're aiming, what you're learning.
Yeah, I'm so blessed to be working with the best organizers in the country and around the world. Just to shout out some, in case some folks want to look up some of these organizations. Of course, the Dream Defenders, who I organize with, but also the Rising Majority. Shout out to the Rising Majority, the Movement for Black Lives, of course. We have the American Muslims for Palestine, AMP, who I talked about. Jewish Voice for Peace, which has been really fundamental to a lot of these actions, direct actions in particular. So many organizations, of course, the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, USCPR, an amazing organization, which actually Ahmed, who co-founded the Dream Defenders, who took me to Palestine for the first time, is now the ED. So I've been working with a range of organizations, primarily doing 2 things. One is faith-based organizing, so mobilizing faith communities to really show just that there's a tradition, interfaith tradition of people of faith, people of conscience who believe that their religious practice is about freedom and justice. then the other is around Black Palestinian solidarity. And so, this huge march that happened on Saturday, myself, Derica Purnell, a lot of the organizations that I just mentioned, we organized something called Dear Gaza, Love Notes on Black Palestinian Solidarity. And we had people from all over the country, who many of whom were part of the march, come to the Culture House in DC. And it was a space for people to exhale, for people to grieve, for people to celebrate, for people to learn, for people to act. And it was all revolved around writing letters to Gaza. Whatever was on your heart, it wasn't, you didn't have to be an academic. You didn't have to read a book. You just had to have something in your heart that you knew you wanted to share. And so we had, for example, like 15 or 16-year-old student who was there with, what is the name of the organization? Power U is the organization. And she got up and shared her letter. We had a mother get up and share their letter. And so that was really something special. And we actually have a website, deargaza.org, and we're going to be building that out. But there is space for you all to write letters, or for your students to write letters, for all the educators who are here. You can upload it if they write it physically, or you can write it right in the chat. So we're going to be collecting those letters as a letter writing project, and then using them, trying to do exhibits, for example, in local communities, obviously having a virtual home for them. So those are kind of the two spaces, but rapid response organizing, you do what you got to do. That's what that is. Anybody who organizes, you pick up chairs, you go get food, you go to Target to make sure that, the protest has everything you need, make sure people have water. That's the beauty of organizing and protesting to me, because it's not just about whether we win our demands. It's about what kind of people we become in the process of making those demands. And me protesting in the streets fundamentally changed who I am. I became really baptized by the possibility of freedom, being alongside others, knowing that I'm not alone, knowing that the world need not be this way, knowing that people are willing to go out into the streets. Remember 2020, people risked their lives with masks on their face, went outside and said, we're not doing this. We're not doing, and that, to me, that was one of the greatest protests in American history during a global pandemic, one of the deadliest pandemics in over a century. If that doesn't tell you that there's something else is possible, then I don't know what will,
I just want to say back, what you said was so profound. Asking what kind of people do we become in the process of making demands, and being baptized by the possibility of freedom. Just profound words to give to us. So thank you for those.
Thank you.
And I also want to say that we've kept you past the time we said we would. I do want to give you space to say anything in closing that you would like to say to folks on the call. But I'm really grateful for your time with us.
Oh, I'm grateful too. I'm really happy to be here. It makes me feel like, just it's a blessing to know that, we're all in this together. I just want to show a lot of appreciation and love and solidarity for educators on every level, in and out of the classroom, pre-K all the way through higher education and beyond, for mothers and parents who are trying to figure out how to explain this. My partner has 2 children, and they pray about this. We learn about it during the day and pray about it at night. So I just want to show so much appreciation. I know many of us are underpaid or not paid. Many of us are trying to fight just to make ends meet, to be able to have enough to sustain ourselves. And for so many of us are also taking their time, their energy to also fight this battle. I think it says a lot about, I think, the best of our tradition as educators, as those who have been in and out of the classroom doing this work. And so just want to encourage everyone to keep on fighting. It's not a coincidence. I'm going to speak about my tradition. It's not a coincidence that during the height of chattel slavery, they cut off people's fingers and hands for learning how to read. It's not a coincidence that Carter G. Woodson, the founder of Negro History Week, which became Black History Month, it's not a coincidence that he said lynching starts in the classroom. And it's not a coincidence that enslaved folks would create Sunday schools. these spaces of learning as they were running, these spaces of learning as they were fighting, and understanding that the classroom as a global place where we learn lessons from every experience in our life is central to the kind of world we want, to the kind of people we want to be, and really to what makes life worth living. So shout out to y'all.
We are so fortunate that you closed out our 2 days. Thank you for those words. Thank you for the inspiration, the guidance, and just thank you for all your work on the ground and with others. And we're lucky to share with you and are deeply appreciative.
Thank you. Thank you all. I appreciate it.
Thank you all for being with us. I know some of you were with us for 2 days, so thank you for being here and learning and listening and being in the struggle.